I wanted to start just by mentioning a few of the books that, if you haven't read them, will tell you a great deal more than you'll learn today about Edith Warner and Tilano. This is probably the first one that came out. This was published in 1960 for the first time. And it's The House at Ottaway Bridge by Peggy Pond Church. And it is a dual memoir of Edith Warner and Peggy. And they were tremendous friends, and this is a wonderful book. It's been in print for more than 50 years, which tells you something. That doesn't happen too often. A later book, which came out, I believe, in 2006, was In the Shadow of Los Alamos, and this is selected writings of Edith herself. And it includes her Christmas letters and a good deal of other. And this is by Patrick Burns. It was edited by Patrick, and he's a Los Alamos native. So he grew up with the story, as several of us did. And this book isn't entirely about Edith, but there are major sections where she's mentioned, and chapter 11 particularly has to do with Peggy writing the book about her. So all of these are available in the bookshop out here. Also, Janet Conant in 109 East Palace Avenue mentioned Edith quite a lot. And it's interesting that Janet is the only person that's taken the leap to say that the relationship between Edith and Tilano was more than platonic. And I don't know that she was correct in that. Nobody does, really. There's no evidence to say which way it went. But personally, my view is that they were friends. Very good relationship. Anyway, if you've seen the exhibit previous, you know that it flows from the earliest days of Edith being in New Mexico on that end, right on around to the end with her death in 1951. So it takes you through quite a range of years as you go through here. Now what I want to do today, I've jotted down some notes so that I don't forget to tell you a few things that I'd like to add to this. You can read the panels. Most of you have already done that, I think. So I want to add to that. What else do we know about her that you might be interested in knowing? And particularly if you're asked questions as docents, maybe it'll be a little easier to answer some of it then. So I'll tell you first off, we're going to look at the pictures down here. Edith was born August 22nd in 1893 in Pennsylvania. She was the oldest of 5 daughters of a Baptist minister and his wife. They would have had a brother older than all of them, but the only boy born to that couple died in infancy. At about 17 years of age, Edith became a school teacher, which was not uncommon back then. She'd finished at the normal school, and she took over a one-room schoolhouse, taught all the subjects. And it's unclear just how long she did that, but from there she moved to a Philadelphia high school where she taught English for a while. However, through all of that, she really didn't enjoy teaching school. And so she began to look for another job, and she became a secretary at the YWCA. And that suited her a little bit more. She was able to sponsor camping outings and picnics and things for the young girls in the area. And that outdoor life suited her, and she began to really need that kind of freedom. But the job still was limiting, and it wasn't enough freedom for her. And in 1921, she had a nervous breakdown. She was very unhappy in her life at that point. And the doctor that she went to recommended that she have a year of outdoor life with no responsibilities. Now, wouldn't we all like to have that? And so she had a friend who had been to New Mexico, and the friend spoke highly of a guest ranch in Frijoles Canyon. And so she decided to come there. And that was going to be her year away. It turned out, obviously, to be much more than that. She fell in love with the land and the people here. And she did spend her year there, but during that year, John and Martha Boyd, who ran the ranch, you can see a picture back there of John, a very typical Westerner from that time period, loved the hat. they decided to up and move from Frijoles Canyon, and they moved into the Jemez further. Just as you're going through on the road, you've passed most of the Valles Caldera, there's a ranch on the left side opposite that climbing wall. That was the Boyd Ranch. Nothing was there when they moved up there. They lived in tents until they could get some buildings made. And it became an interesting adventure for her. Actually, the Boyds sort of, I believe, became like second parents to Edith. She was very close to them throughout her life. And she stayed there with them for several months. Her job was to go into Jemez Springs for the mail. And you did that by riding to Jemez Springs, and it was an all-day thing. To us it seems pretty close, but if you're doing it on horseback, it's not real close. So that was quite an adventure for her. In 1922, Edith had come to New Mexico. She learned quite a lot of things. Here's a nice quote that I found about her time at Frijoles Canyon. "This was the destination of my first long ride. One early day in November 1922, I rode Chiquita, who had to trot to keep up with Mr. Boyd on his horse. Snow overtook us, and I was cold, weary, and a very stiff girl. Dinner in front of the fireplace was most welcome. I little knew that I'd later spend so many months here with Connie." Now, Connie is Connie Smithwick of Anchor Ranch. You've heard of Anchor Ranch. It was out where S Side is now. And she and Frank and their 3 boys were the managers of that ranch. And they were the caretakers of a young man named Alex Ross, who was, I don't want to say necessarily mentally deficient. He could learn, and his major problem was that he had judgment problems. He couldn't care for his own finances and things like that. He didn't know how to spend the money. He didn't know how to make decisions. So it was a reasoning problem that didn't function right for Alex. And so he was actually the owner of record of the ranch, but he needed caretakers, and his parents had taken care of that with the Smithwicks. About this same time, Robert Oppenheimer had a ranch over near Pecos in the mountains, up near Cowles. And he took his first trip into the Jemez. And so both of them at that time were sort of exploring a new venue for them that in the future became important for both of them. I think that's kind of an irony. He took a pack trip from Frijoles into the Valle Grande at that time. The other person who intersected later with them was Peggy Ponchurch. And at that time, Peggy was a student at Smith College and dating a young master at her father's rank school. So they're all starting to come into this area, and they're all going to intersect in a very important way. In 1923, like I said, the Boyds shifted up there, and eventually Edith left the Boyds. She was supposed to be there for 1 year, and at that time she went back to Albuquerque, and her sister Velma Ludlow, came out to live with her in Albuquerque, and Vel got a job, and Edith knew she wanted to stay, but she didn't have any work. You have to have money to do things like that. And so most of that year she spent looking for a job, but never really found one she thought she'd like. And so they lived sort of off of what Vel was making that year. And I have not found out what Vel did as a job in Albuquerque. It would be interesting to know. But the 2 sisters became very close during that year and forged a relationship that she did not have with her other 3 sisters. So that was an important time for both of them. And Vel ended up coming to New Mexico to visit often because she liked New Mexico as well. After her husband died many years later, she actually moved back to New Mexico and lived in Santa Fe in her later years. So. Peggy and Fern became engaged that summer of 1923, and at the time Maria and Julian were beginning to make their pottery, and things were shaping up to come to a conclusion in years later. Edith lived with the Smithwicks for a time after that venture in Albuquerque. She had met them, earlier, and she eventually became Alex Ross's governess, and she spent a few years with them. And that, ironically, is where she learned to make the famous chocolate cake. Now, why Connie had the recipe, I don't know where it came from, but that was where she learned it. And that's kind of stuck with her legend all along.
You wouldn't mention that right before lunch.
Oh, sorry. Especially since you can't get any anywhere. Now, how it came about that Peggy met Connie Smithwick, we don't know. But Smithwick was a good friend of Genevieve Ranger, who was the nurse at the Los Alamos Ranch School at the time. So I'm guessing that the intersection there happened at the ranch school, and then Peggy went to visit at the ranch. And that's the first place she met Edith. And her first impression was not particularly a good one. She thought she was very mousy and had kind of a funky little dress on, and she puts all of this, you'll read it in House at Ottery Bridge. She was not real impressed with her as an Easterner being out here. But certainly she corrected that problem later. She was tremendously impressed with her as a person, as everyone was who met Edith. Let's see what else is here. Oh, you should know too that Edith went back east at one time. She did fail to find a job and was out of money, and she had to go back for a while. And she spent, we think, about 2 years there. It's not real clear in any of the research, but I think that's probably about the right conclusion. And then she was losing her health again back there in the bad winters, in the bad air, because it was an industrial area around Philadelphia where her parents lived. And so she was about to fail again, and she returned here. But this time in the West, she went to Denver to a place called Matildan Health School. And she was there for a time. That was the first place that she decided she could write. And they had a little booklet that they put out with health suggestions. And she wrote articles in 5 of those. And so far I've managed to find copies of 3 of them. I'm still looking for the other 2. I'd like to have the whole set for our archive. But someday maybe we'll manage to do that. Then in 1928, Edith left the Denver area and came back here. She returned to New Mexico and started hunting for a job. She was 35 years old by then, and the options were not looking good. She was not finding anything. She was pretty much out of money when she met A.J. Connell in Santa Fe. And it's
Who, AJ being the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just assumed everybody knew. He was the director of the ranch school, and he was Los Alamos Ranch School. He built this thing on his own, style and so on. Ashley Pond founded it certainly, but AJ is the one who developed it. And so it's unclear if he was actually advertising for somebody or she just heard he was looking for somebody to watch the freight that was delivered off of the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge railroad that came through and put in a boxcar down there at Ottawee. And by the way, almost everybody in Los Alamos pronounces that name wrong. It is Ottawee and not Ottawee Bridge, just to throw that out. And so she hired on in desperation, even though it didn't pay enough money to survive hardly, and took the job as the freight watcher for the ranch school. And that kept people from breaking in and stealing things out of the boxcar down there. And on the 1st of May, 1928, she moved into the existing little house that was there. And there's a picture of the house right over there as it looked when she moved in. And you can tell it's really small, looks like it would blow over in a strong wind. And that was her first house. It was built onto and added onto by Tilano and some of the other people from San Ildefonso to make it into a much more livable place. But that took some time. Connie and Frank Smithwick were the ones that primarily helped her to move in. And there's a funny quote over there. Genevieve Ranger wrote to Connie, and they were really good friends, and Genevieve just chewed her up about letting her move into that, she called it a sand trap, all by herself, with no experience. And she thought it was all wrong. And Connie says, but I knew it was the right thing. And of course, it turned out to be the right thing. Edith continued to write. In 1931, she published a piece in something called the Neighborhood publication, like a small magazine, and it was what was called a settlement quarterly. And it's unclear to me at this point what kind of publication that was, and I've never found a copy of it, although we have some written records of what the article contained. In 1937, and we're a good ways down in here now, into the pictures, Robert Oppenheimer stops at Edith's place for the first time on one of his pack trips. And he meets her, he has some of the chocolate cake, and presumably they talk and become acquaintances. 6 years before, and this is 6 years before, he ends up asking Edith to open her tea room, as she called it, to the Manhattan Project scientists. And so that's laying the background for that encounter. In 1941, before the war has begun, Robert Oppenheimer stops at Edith's once more, and in this time he has his wife with him. And so Kitty meets her for the first time. And then in the autumn, we know what happened. In December, we were bombed, and Pearl Harbor initiates our involvement in the war. And so, not very long after that, the government comes looking at this area, and the ranch school is closed, condemned, taken over with the homesteaders, and the Manhattan Project then is formed in this area. At that point, Edith has lost all of her income because she can't watch freight for the ranch school anymore. There are very few tourists out to stop at her tea room and buy gas, and she is worried that she's not going to be able to stay here. And she says, "Doubts assailed me. Could I swing this business with gas rationed? Ought I put aside selfish desire and go back to the outside world and have a war job?" Well, it turned out a war job was waiting for her. It was just a real different type. In 1943, in February 8th to be exact, the last of the ranch school personnel leaves, and the government officially takes over everything on the plateau. In the spring of 43, Robert and Kitty begin to go to Edith's house in the evening sometime, visit with her, and have dinner. But at that point, it's just a friendship sort of thing. She's invited them down, she makes a little extra food, and they all sit and eat. But at that point, he gets an idea. His scientists need a place to get away once in a while. And so he asks Edith if she will fix those kinds of dinners for, say, 2 couples each evening. And she agrees because they're going to pay $2 a dinner. That's pretty good money back then. And so eventually that was so popular that they had to have reservations weeks in advance. And but it did. It offered a respite at an important time when those people really needed it. And by all indications, Edith was quite a good cook. How she baked that cake, which is temperamental to bake on our stoves now, and she's doing it in a wood oven. I don't know. I don't think I could have done it. It flops for me in my fancy oven at home. In 1944, there was sort of a turning point for Edith. In 1944, Niels Bohr comes to the U.S. as a member of the British mission. Now, I don't know how many of you know that she had a very special friendship with Niels Bohr. They just hit it off right away. You know that in your life, you've met people where you feel very attracted to them. You're sort of on the same thought wavelength, and it's just different. And that's the way it was for her and Bohr. And he would go down for dinners, and they would talk and so on. And they developed a very nice relationship, which, of course, after the war, he left and didn't come back here. But I'm wondering if there was some communication in letters and things along the way. There's no record of that, so we can't be sure, but it makes me wonder. In 1947, we're all the way over here now. Edith's log house, or wooden house, was sitting so close to the plans for the new highway that were going to come through to Los Alamos that it would have been impossible to stay there. I mean, it wouldn't have actually touched the house, but it would have been real close. The noise would have been terrible of the trucks and cars and things going by, and all of her peacefulness that she enjoyed at that site would have been gone.
See, when was that again? What year?
It was 1947, yeah. So, actually, that decision was possibly made in 46 because they built the house in 47, so it didn't happen all at once. So it was pretty clear that they were going to have to move. And so the scientists who needed that good road came together with the Indians at San Ildefonso, and they offered to build her and Tilano a new house. Now, one thing I didn't mention that you've read in all of these things was that actually Tilano came to live at the bridge with Edith to build a new room on her house, to build a guest house eventually. And so he was there so often, she just asked him to stay. Well, here, there is reference to him picking out which of the two bedrooms he wanted. Now that to me is also a clue that their relationship was simply a friendship, a wonderful, deep friendship, but no more. And so the new house began to come together then, and you can see pictures of it in stages over here. The scientists would gather, they would have lunch. You can see a very young Nick King having cake, being cut by Phil Morrison. Some of these are just wonderful pictures. The color ones you see there are part of the pictures that Nick King's father took at the time. And he still had that collection, and we've since borrowed it. These pictures had to be enhanced a little bit because those are very old color pictures. But they came out very well. Don Taylor did that for us, and you know how his work is. So there is a story around that the Indians taught the scientists to make adobes and how to put them together in the walls and so on. But they didn't quite get it. And so the Indians would leave them alone during the day and let them build and do their thing. And then when the scientists went home at night, they redid all of it. Now, I don't know if that's really true, but I think it's possible. It's a fun story either way. So the new house was erected in 1950. Tilano, we think, was about 80, really getting up in age. And still doing pretty well, though. And about that time, Edith is diagnosed with cancer. And she first went to Chicago to try to have some treatment. They did an operation and just kind of closed her back up because they couldn't do anything with it. And she came back. She actually had some treatment at the hospital in Los Alamos with the new types of treatment that were using radioactive gold. And Peggy had to make a statement. Peggy Ponchurch, having lost her home to the Manhattan Project, you can imagine, wasn't real happy about things. But she said in a letter to someone that she thought she might have to bless the bomb after all if this treatment worked. And so, ironically, that statement was made, but the treatment did not work for Edith. It helped a little bit for a while, and then it stopped helping. So at that point, she stopped all treatment and accepted reality. And her friends gathered around her at times. They learned from her, from that experience. Some of the comments that were made, May Sarton, the famous New England writer, knew her and a lot of the people. And she wrote, "Tilano will be very much older after Miss Warner has gone." And of course that was true. He only lasted another 2 years after she died. Sarah McComb, the wife of one of the physicists up here, wrote, "She showed us how to live, now she's showing us all how to die." Edith was always a spiritual woman. She accepted things the way nature had them, And that was the order of things, and that's the way she thought it was supposed to be. And her death is no exception. She was very, I can't think of the right word, but she accepted the idea and didn't fight it. So on May 4th in 1951, Edith died at age 57. And you can see, if she was 57 and he was 80 the year before, there was a huge difference in their ages. The year before her death, Niels Bohr had addressed the United Nations, urging that atomic power be controlled and used for the benefit of humanity and not its doom. Sometime after May of 51, after Edith died, Bohr sent an autographed copy of the text of his speech to Velma Ludlow, her sister, with an inscription that read, "To Mrs. Benjamin Ludlow, in gratitude for the friendship of your sister." And he later made a statement about Edith, a quote from Niels Bohr that we didn't put on the wall. I found it too late to get it in the production. It says, "The memory of Edith Warner, a noble personality, will always be cherished by everyone who met her. Although in the days of the war it was not possible to speak freely about the hopes and anxieties of one's mind, I felt that she had an intuitive understanding, which was a bond between us." So I think those really give you an idea of the depth of the friendship there. Lois Bradbury was the one who was with Edith when she died. Lois and Edith were wonderful friends, and Lois was a huge help to her in that last phase of her life. I did not know Lois Bradbury. Some of you may have known her, but she seems to have been a remarkable woman, and I think Edith was very lucky to have her as a friend. In a letter from Peggy Pond Church to May Sarton, who was a good friend of hers, she described the last moments of Edith's life, the preparation for Tilano. As you read on one of the panels, Edith knew him so well, she figured he'd last just about 2 years. Mm-hmm. So she ordered new clothes to last 2 years. Mm-hmm. So she got it exactly right. Her burial is described for May Sarton, so she knew something about that. And it was according to the ceremonial rites of the San Ildefonso Pueblo. And she is buried south of the road, on the other side of the bridge over there, I don't know how far down, near the river, and the Indians break pottery and spread it over the top of the grave, and that was done. And so I think she would have been very pleased to have been included in that ceremony, because she loved that Pueblo.
Is that still marked today?
It's probably, you probably would find some pottery somewhere. It's not marked, so nobody knows exactly where it is. And then Peggy wrote in that letter, as kind of an epitaph, "Edith was sort of a last link with the Pajarito Plateau that was woven so deeply and is still in my own life." And I think that explains why The House at Ottaway Bridge is the book that it is. It tells an incredible story of two women and how they related in friendship. And I hope if you haven't read it, you'll make time to do it. You won't regret it. When we opened this exhibit on the 1st, we had invited the Pueblo to come. We sent an official letter to the governor and hoped that he would mention it. We went to the visitor center, we put up flyers and so on. So we didn't know if we would be successful. San Ildefonso is a bit insular. They don't exactly involve themselves in other activities. And we even offered to put this up as an exhibit after we take it down in some of their facilities. And we didn't get a direct response from that, but on the opening night, Judith Stauber, who was the co-curator of this, looked up, and there were two women that we felt certain were from the Pueblo. Mm-hmm. And they were going around looking at the pictures, and they stopped at this one of Tilano with a double picture. And the older of the two women started crying. Mm-hmm. And Judith walked over to them and introduced herself and asked, about them. And it turns out they were Tilano's he's their great uncle. I don't know how that works in reverse. But they knew him. They remembered him personally. And the older one, of course, knew him better than the younger one. And she was, reflecting all on her memories, obviously. And so we asked them to come back and sit with us out here afterwards, after they looked through the thing. But Edith walked through with her. I was busy with some other people, so I wasn't aware that all of this was going on at first. The first thing they asked her is, where did you get all of these pictures? Which leads me to think that they may not have any pictures of him. Secondly, they wanted to know who wrote the text. And they were very pleased with it, which was gratifying to me because I wrote the text. I was very careful in the text not to phrase something that might be offensive, because I hoped they would come. And they finished all of this and they came out and talked to us, and we were able to ask them questions of the type that we thought we'd never have the answers. One of the things was, what did he die of? And it was cancer, again. Where was he buried? I wanted to know if he was buried near Edith. That's not the case. He was buried at the church in San Ildefonso, in the churchyard, like they do. Because he was a governor of the Pueblo, so he was dignitary to them. They were able to tell us what it was like inside Edith's new house, because they actually lived there for a little while as children. Tilano's family took turns coming and staying with him in those 2 years that he needed some care and help. And so the girls remembered, and there was no water, no running water, no electricity in that house when they lived there. But they loved it. They said that they had such good memories of being there and playing in that area. And Tilano, who loved children, he didn't have any of his own, so he made the most of loving other people's children. And so it was just an amazing thing to go back in time with these women sitting there. It was one of the most special things for Judith and I about this exhibit, is to meet them. And what I intend to do, there have been comments in the guest book that, why don't you put these kinds of things in a book for people to buy on some of the exhibits? And I think this is a classic one for that. And so we are going to try to do that. So you may be able to buy this exhibit in a book form at some point. And we'll try to keep the cost down on them. But when I get that put together on a CD that we can print from, I'm going to make copies for that family and take them down there. Because I think if they don't have any pictures of him, this would be really appreciated. And we appreciated so much their coming and sharing, because they were part of all of this in a way that we weren't. So anyway, I think that's about all I have to add to this, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you do have. So. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah.
Hi. Where did the pictures come from?
Where did the pictures come from? Most of them are from our archives. Quite a few of them, particularly the color ones, are from Nick King's family archive. But we have copies of these in our archive now. He donated that. So, and then 2 pictures of the guest ranch at Frijoles and of John Boyd we bought from UNM collection photographs. And the one right down there, the big one, is from the Chavez History Library photos. And so that was it. But most of them, ironically, are already in our archive. We just weren't aware of it.
And
So-
who is Nick King?
I'm sorry?
Who is Nick King?
He is the son of Perk King, who was here during the Manhattan Project and a physicist. And I think he continued with the lab for a number of years after the war. And then his son became a physicist and also worked here. So, and he lives here part-time, but he's retired. And so I don't know. I'd never had the opportunity to meet him, so maybe none of you have either. But he was very generous. The headdress and the little bow and arrow were made for him as a little boy by Tilano. It was his Christmas gift.
Really?
So,
Has Nick been interviewed for
yeah, I think so.
Cause, yeah, I mean, this is wonderful. And
Mhm.
I knew him and worked with him, but I never knew
The
this
connection.
part, yeah.
I know. It's amazing. Well, he has some pretty amazing memories from all of
I
it, so
imagine,
I'm sure
yeah.
that he's been oral historied. So,
Could you explain a little more about the structures? You
Okay.
said that wood cabin was there.
right, the wood cabin was there. Ironically, that was on the other side of the road at one time. It was part of a lumber camp, and it was moved. It was built by a Basque lumber guy named Shorty Police. And we don't know too much about Shorty except that he had to leave real sudden one night because he was bootlegging. So he disappeared and it was empty and it was sitting near the boxcar. He had been washing the freight when he was there.
Okay.
But I don't know if Connell paid him or not. I assume maybe he did. But so he took off and it was vacant and that's where Edith moved in. Now that was added to. Then there was a well house out in front of that, which is still there. It's crumbling, but that part's still there. Then they built, Tilano and some others, a guest house so she could have paying guests at that part. But they added onto this some rooms, and you can see that in this picture here because it's a bigger structure in the color picture. And
I'm struck by.
and over
the-
here you can see in a black and white.
Okay, so did they add a room to be the tea house?
The way I understand it, the living room was in the middle, the kitchen was on one side, and a bedroom on the other side. And I think Tilano didn't actually live in that house. He lived in the guest house when it wasn't being rented out. But that's just an understanding from vague hints.
So if you went down for dinner, you were
You were in the living room. Yeah, that would have been the dining. They set up a table in there. And she had Navajo rugs and huge pots that would be worth thousands of dollars now.
So I would understand where Edith would get the chocolate for the cake before the war, but during the
During the
war,
war.
wouldn't that have been rationed or at least
My
shortage?
guess is it came from the Los Alamos commissary.
Okay. I was
so-
wondering if Oppenheimer had
I
some
think
hand
he
in
probably
getting
took
that
care of
chocolate.
supplies. Mhm.
Yeah.
Brown paper.
If he-
bag.
Lois?
If he couldn't get them, nobody could.
Yeah, well,
So-
that's what I was guessing, but I just
Yeah,
wanted
I'm
that
sure, but we don't know
confirmation.
for certain. I can't answer that absolutely.
Yeah,
But
because
it just makes sense. So.
it would
Yeah,
also
it does.
take butter and eggs, which the
Oh,
eggs
yeah,
they
you'd
might
have to
be
have a
able
lot
to
of
get,
things like that.
but butter would be short
Mhm,
on hand as well.
definitely. Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
that cake,
had some
the cake
glass.
and the frosting take some.
The
So.
girls
Yeah.
made sure everybody was eating well up here. It's
Oh,
like
I
this
think
Well,
so.
no,
Yeah, well,
here, no.
there are other references in books and things left behind that the commissary stocked things you couldn't get anywhere else.
Yeah.
They kept these people happy. So,
I'm taken by the log cabin that you say was moved from the
I
logging
know,
camp.
isn't that amazing?
Well, it's vertical, and you know, there's always this
That's
discussion
right.
of mystery about the vertical logs in the lodge. And if you look at the pictures of the big house, they were vertical.
Vertical.
So I'm wondering if there was sort of this evolutionary, you know,
Maybe it's a Basque
Idea.
thing.
That's a good point, Tom. I can't answer that, but it certainly leads you to think that there's some correlation.
Yeah,
I
there's
never
some-
noticed.
Yeah.
I've never seen that picture before.
Well, I hadn't either before we did this exhibit.
So what is happening to the same space today?
That was another, a part of another thing that we asked the women that were here. I thought that the new house was probably still rented out. I've seen vehicles over there occasionally or a light at night, but it has not been rented out since 1972. Nobody's lived in it. So I think it may not be in very good shape because of that. Now, the other side, this house was torn down, probably not long after they moved out of it. But the house you see there now was built sometime later, probably in the 50s, is my guess. It was there when I moved here in 59, so. The well house and another structure toward the west side are original. And since I've moved here, that ugly little concrete building has been added. I don't know what it is. I don't think anybody's living there, but there has been occasionally, okay, thanks. There has been occasionally some people living there over the decades. I don't think it's probably much of a house, and so it's just sitting there. I don't know what they're gonna do with it. There have been people in the past, some guy from Texas that had a lot of money, wanted to actually put a tea room in again. I don't think they would allow that to happen.
Probably
That's
not.
just my guess, but I don't think that'll ever happen.
Thank you.
In the new house that they built, when I came here, it was my understanding that Samuel Gladstone, who wrote the primer, or sort of LA1
Uh-huh.
on nuclear weapons, lived there, and he was allowed, he had a safe, and he was allowed to keep classified
Really?
documents there.
In the new
Now,
house.
In that new house.
Well, I do know that
So
they,
I don't know if
that
that could be
they,
followed up on, but that was the legend or at that
I
time
don't think
on it.
that's impossible, because I do know that they have rented it to Anglo couples. I don't know if you remember Barbara Storm, she was here, worked for the lab for a while. She may still be here, I'm not sure. She and her husband, as newlyweds, rented that house for about a year.
Hmm.
So, it's possible
A
that,
woman came into the museum.
I'm sorry,
A woman came into the museum and she had lived in that house.
really?
And they had lived up here, I think, in the Gold Apartments, and her
Oh,
husband
darn.
was a amateur radio guy. And the antenna he put up, she said, was interfering with everybody's reception.
Uh-huh.
So they had to move, and they got that house, and they went up on the hill and put the radio antenna up there and everything, and lived there for a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, at some point, they ran electricity in. I don't know about water, but there's a line going in there. You can see it from the road. So, yeah, that's at least probably three
It was in the
people that
70s,
we've known.
yeah.
Yeah.
She said she moved, but I thought it was a little later. I thought she said
Yeah.
75, but maybe it was 72.
Mhm. So,
Mhm.
well, it's interesting. It's a fascinating part of our history, and even with this exhibit, I learned new things. It keeps coming. So,
I think this is the only exhibit I've read word for word, or I'm not quite, maybe I haven't quite finished
you.
there.
That's a compliment.
But, yeah, it's just, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
well, it was fun. This is one of the neatest things I've done with the Historical Society is put this together. So, Judith and I were very proud of it. Well, thank you all.
Well, thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.